French have accused us of financial blackmail. I would argue that maybe it's the other way round.
Yeah, and also, I'm sorry, but, they've... What's 54 add 28?
Yeah.
It's too early in the morning to be doing that kind of maths for me. But we've given them £44 million.
Oh, that's a concern. But yeah, no, it's...
I did get an A in GCSE maths, I'll have you know.
Did you? So yeah, no.
We've given them, £54 million. Well, Priti Patel has supposed. I don't know if she's actually given them
the
entirety of the money. Not yet.
Not yet.
And so clearly they haven't been putting the money we gave them last year either, the £28 million we gave them in November to try and tackle the migrant crisis. They haven't put that to good use either because, we're still very much in a migrant crisis across the channel.
I don't really see what they can argue about. It's like, oh, yeah, you promised us a load of money and you're not giving it to us. It's like, well, yeah, you promised us that you'd do something to stop migrants coming over, and every single day it's a new record.
The thing is, they have no incentive, do they, to sort of to stop the migrants from coming into our waters, so to speak, because, why would they? That gets the problem sort of out of their hands. They clearly have a migrant crisis themselves. They clearly have a lot of migrants in France anyway that they have to deal with. So, there is an incentive for them perhaps to push some of them our way.
Yeah, 100%. And also, when you look at the cost that it's costing us to keep people in hotels, etc., it's about 70 million quid a year. Or when you factor in the fact that we give the French 54 million or whatever it is, well, if they've done the numbers there and just decided actually it's going to cost us more to keep these people here, it is going to be, I think it's going to be a concern going forward, by the way. I can see massive issues just around the corner with Priti Patel's new policy, which is or statement anyway. And it's something people have been calling for a very, very long time. And it's something that certainly people, I think, will find quite popular, which is the idea that we might start towing migrant boats back towards France. But there are just some practical issues with that, aren't there? Which is like, well, what if the French just say, well, we're not going to do anything with them? And then do you leave people in the channel just indefinitely? You can't do that.
Exactly, yeah. Well, on that top story, let's give you more on that. An ex-Border Force chief has said that the idea of turning back migrant boats heading across the Channel to the UK would be a highly dangerous tactic if adopted. Tony Smith, who's the former Border Force Director General, said the UK's top priority should be the preservation of all life above all else, and called for a diplomatic solution to its war of words with France over efforts to tackle migrants crossing the Channel by boat. His comments come following reports that Home Secretary Priti Patel has sanctioned tactics to turn back migrant boats towards the continent to stop them from making the journey to the UK.
Yes, now for more on this story, we are joined by Frank Furedi, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent. Thank you very much, Frank, for joining us. Just when it comes to this issue now, I suppose the preservation of human life, I suppose, has to be the priority, does it? I mean, one might argue, just to play devil's advocate, that if you do decide to get in a dinghy and cross the busiest shipping lane in the world, maybe you put yourself at risk.
Well, I think there's a danger that the idea of the preservation of human life becomes a form of political blackmail, so that every time we try to do anything that is decisive, you get accused of saying, well, you're putting people's lives at risk. And it seems to me that if you adopt that approach, and that leads to basically a policy of paralysis, you can never do anything. Because the very moment you try to stop people coming into the country, somebody sooner or later will kind of criticize you for putting those people's lives at risk. So we have to be fairly objective and hard-nosed about this and decide, what comes first, the maintenance of Britain's border or this kind of willingness to accept the criticism of every NGO, every media organization, every European Union official that will tell us to keep the status quo.
Now, you're a professor of sociology, of course, so how this all affects society is of concern, I suppose, would be of concern to you. And what do you think the impact on society is when people see, people illegally coming into this country, and often people feel like they're sort of given housing and, they're given things that perhaps even people who are Brits and who have paid into the system wouldn't automatically get from the state. What do you think the impact of that is?
I think it's massive, and I think the problem is not the migrants as such. I mean, I'm a migrant myself. I was born in East Europe, so I've got no problems with immigration. And the real problem is that once national borders become a fiction, and that's really what's happening at the moment, the borders that might as well not exist. It's kind of a geographic fiction. Then every single border is called into question. The border between a citizen and a non-citizen, a border between people who lived in a community for generations and generations, and somebody that just come in, who's got the same rights as they do, means that the rights of a citizen is called into question. And I think under those circumstances, we become a society that loses its way, becomes disoriented. And above all, what it leads to is that the meaning of being British becomes a bit of a joke. It no longer has any great significance. It's got no status attached to it. When that happens, I think society runs into very big trouble.
Yes, well, I can understand where you're coming from. Do you find it incredible that as a society we're constantly telling ourselves that we're all racist and that we're all terrible people, yet at the same time, clearly people from other societies are desperate to come here, aren't they?
Well, not just that. I mean, in my career, I've written 3 books on racism. I've written a book on Africa and the way that racism has evolved historically. And I've traveled a lot. I lived in many countries. I lecture all over the world. And one thing I know for sure is that although we have racist people in Britain, of any society that I've been in, I think that Britain is the least racist. Now, that's a very big claim. But when I go to London and I watch young kids hang around, when I see the large number of interracial couples, when I talk to my son and his friends and all these other people, I do not detect even a minimal amount of racism. You want to know what racism is like? You can go to European countries where the problem is far, far greater, but nobody talks about that. And I think there's a danger of creating a kind of British self-loathing where we blame ourselves for problems that, simply are fantasy problems rather than real.
Yeah, I can completely get that, absolutely, and I think it's depressing for me personally anyway to hear constantly we're pumped full, aren't we, of this idea of unconscious racism and this, that, and the other, and then at the same time you think, well, actually, I've kind of travelled relatively extensively, and I go around and I think, well, there's probably nowhere else that I'd rather be. I think really is the issue with that. Are you concerned now that the level of public anger, I think, at what's happening in the Channel might actually foster some more racism, though, because it might lead to a lot of kind of maybe anti-illegal immigrant sentiment, for example, and that's not going to be good for us, is it?
No, I think there's always a problem of people reacting, especially when they're lectured and told that they have no choice but to put up with the present situation. I think that creates a certain degree of anxiety. And I think there's a danger that some people will get very defensive and react in an unhelpful way. That's always a danger, which is why I think it's quite important that British society has a grown-up debate and discussion about immigration. I would even be in favor of having a referendum in Britain where the people are asked, what are you prepared to do in order to defend Britain's border and get popular opinion to indicate, to voice its views in order to give the government the strength and the backbone to be able to deal with this more effectively than it's doing at the moment.
What kind of questions do you think you'd ask then in that referendum? What would you say? Because, I suppose if the vast majority of the British public just say tow them back to France, I imagine the French might have something to say about that.
Well, I'm not so sure, but that's one of the questions I would ask. Are you prepared for the government to turn the boats back? Secondly, are you prepared to find a solution whereby people that come into this country legally are basically taken out of the country in some other ways? Like, for example, in Australia, they've taken people out of Australia and put them in other places, sort of near Australia, or got the Indonesians to accept them. So there are a lot of questions to be asked, and basically they're to do with the fact, what is a civilized, sort of fair, proportionate way of dealing with illegal immigration? And basically we want the people of this country to give voice to what they think should be done in order for the politicians to have a mandate to act on this question.
Well, Professor Frank Furedi, thank you so much for joining us this morning.